Hello, hi. Welcome to this recording on our commercial law lectures on the law of agency. And today we want to look at this topic of the doctrine of ratification. We know that a principal can be allowed to ratify the acts of his agent, and in so doing, authorize his agent to do something for which that agent previously had no authority to do. So, for example, this could be a case of the agent having made a contract with a third party without any authority at all whatsoever. But yet, based on the fulfillment of certain requirements or conditions, the principal may ratify, the principal may take over that unauthorized act of the agent, and then, retrospectively, the moment the principal had ratified the act, retrospectively, the act of the agent will now be validated. The principal had now ratified the contract, taken over the contract, and he will now be bound to the contract and will be able to enforce the contract against a third party. Ratification is a method of how agency can be created in allowing the principal to be bound to a contract where he can now sue the third party, and of course for the third party to sue him as well. Now, one of the conditions to be satisfied is that the ratification must not affect another party. And this is somewhat difficult for us to understand or follow, mainly because we have two cases that appear to be inconsistent, the cases of Bird and Brown and Bolton and Lambert. So this recording is a focus on these two cases and how to reconcile Bird and Brown with Bolton and Lambert. In the first case of Bird and Brown, you may recall that the court did not allow for the ratification because they said it would affect a third party and hence not fulfill this requirement that it should not be affecting another party. But however, in Bolton and Lambert, the court came to a different conclusion, and despite a third party being affected, seemingly so, but yet the court allowed for the doctrine of ratification. In examining how to reconcile these two cases, let's begin by looking at the facts of Bird and Brown. And you may recall that this case involved the act of an agent to stopping the goods in transit for his principal. Here was his principal who was an unpaid seller. And being an unpaid seller, the agent now stopped the goods in transit, but this was done without authority. It was an unauthorized act of the agent of stoppage in transit on behalf of his unpaid seller principal. Subsequently, of course, the goods arrived, and the trustees in bankruptcy of the buyer who could not and had not paid for the goods, the trustees in bankruptcy had now seized and obtained those goods upon arrival. Subsequently still, the principal now ratifies the unauthorized act of the agent and now tries to take over that stoppage in transit to now take over those goods that were in the hands of the trustees in bankruptcy. Now we know that the effect of ratification, if it is permitted, is that it will have a retrospective effect. In other words, it will now validate, it will now make that unauthorized act of the agent to become authorized. If that were to be permitted to happen, this means to say now that the agent had properly stopped goods in transit and can now seize those goods and take it away from the trustees in bankruptcy. And so to this, the court concluded that this will not be permitted. So Bird and Brown, the conclusion was where they did not allow for ratification, and it's precisely because of the point I just mentioned that it will affect the proprietary interests of the third party, this being the trustees in bankruptcy. And so you can see clearly how third parties have already obtained the goods. And if we were to allow for P to ratify the act of his agent, it will end up depriving the trustees in bankruptcy, the third party, of their property in the goods. And that goes against the requirement for ratification, where it must not affect third parties. Now that's one reason as to how to understand Bird and Brown, and we'll see shortly how this can be contrasted from the other case of Bolton and Lambert. But there's yet another reason, and that is where the court said that the act of the agent was not or rather was a total nullity, and cannot be ratified. And when the court said that the act of the agent was a total nullity, this is by reference to the fact that by the time the goods had arrived, this meant to say that transit had ended, and so there's nothing more for which the agent could have done, or the principal could have done, because the moment stoppage in transit, the right had exhausted, because transit had come to an end. Therefore, there's really nothing, in some sense, for the agent to do. There's nothing for P to ratify. The act of the agent was a total nullity, in a sense that the right of stoppage in transit had expired, had exhausted. It's no longer capable to be exercised because transit had ended. And so accordingly, there's really nothing for P to ratify. And these are the two main reasons that one will need to understand and be able to write in an examination to explaining Bird and Brown and how the court did not allow for the ratification. In contrast, there is the case of Bolton and Lambert, and let's also now try to understand the facts of the case, where this case involved an unauthorized act of the agent, but in relation to accepting an offer from the offeror. And so again, the agent thought that he was doing something good and had accepted an offer, but this was unauthorized and that he had no authority to do so from his principal. Subsequently, here you find that the offeror revoked the offer. Now, in a way, technically speaking, you would appreciate that it is permissible for offerors to revoke their offers so long as there was no acceptance. And here, based on the facts of Bolton and Lambert, since there was no authority on the agent to accept the offer, and that there is no lawful binding acceptance yet because of the lack of authority, it seems to be that the offeror is correct and should be permitted to revoke his offer, which is now done. However, subsequently, P now ratifies the unauthorized act of the agent, and of course we recall how they would have a retrospective effect to now validate the unauthorized act, to now make it authorized, to make it valid. And so the issue came before the court, whether or not should this ratification be allowed, because if we were to allow for the ratification, this meant that this would prevent the offeror from being able to revoke his offer. And the court came to the conclusion to say yes, that we will allow for ratification, and they distinguished itself from the earlier case of Bird and Brown, a much older case, by stating that it did not affect the proprietary interests of any third party. And if you examine these facts of this case of Bolton, it seems to be true that no third party's interests were affected. It was not as if the property had ended up with anyone else that would now deprive the third party of proprietary interests. Here, the effect of ratification in Bolton and Lambert merely prevented the offeror from revoking his offer. It does not affect the property interests of anyone else. Moreover, the court distinguished itself also from Bird and Brown by saying that the act of the agent was not a total nullity. So just now in Bird and Brown, you may recall we said that the act was a total nullity, but here was the opposite. The court said that the act by the unauthorized agent to accept the offer was not a total nullity. Now, the reason why the court said it was not a total nullity can be distinguishable based on the very facts of the earlier case of Bird and Brown, where in Bird and Brown, you may recall that the right of stoppage in transit had expired because the goods have arrived. There's no more transit for the goods to effect that stoppage in transit. But here the facts are, in a sense, distinctively different, in that the only reason why the acceptance was not yet valid or lawful was the lack of authority, for which now the principal is ratifying and therefore retrospectively endorsing the act. And the moment that is done, this now have the effect of preventing the offeror from revoking the offer. So the overall effect of Bolton and Lambert is that the unauthorized act, the moment it becomes authorized upon the principal's ratification, is that it prevents now the offeror from revoking his offer. It did not mean to say that anybody's proprietary interest or any third party's property rights were affected. And so in that sense, in comparison now to the earlier case of Bird and Brown, this is a case where it did not seem inequitable to allow for the ratification. And in fact, this would really be the main distinctive point to reconciling Bolton and Lambert and Bird and Brown, which is to ask this question: whether or not would ratification end up being inequitable? In Bolton and Lambert, the court was of the opinion that there is no inequity. There is no third-party proprietary interest being affected, and therefore we allowed for the ratification. But in the earlier case of Bird and Brown, it would clearly be inequitable because it deprived the trustees in bankruptcy of the goods that they've already obtained. And so here would be the two cases and how we can reconcile Bird and Brown, Bolton and Lambert. So I hope that you had enjoyed this lecture and that these two cases can now be fairly easily understood. And if you have liked this recording, please feel free to subscribe, to share, and to like. Thank you.